President.
Senator from Idaho.
Thank you. Madam President, I rise today to discuss Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And in a moment, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to pass some legislation which has been kicking around here for a while and is way overdue. What we've witnessed over the past 5 days is a flagrant act of unprovoked aggression perpetrated by Russia against Ukraine. The world we are living in today is different from the one we lived in last week. For months, I, along with my Senate colleagues on both sides of the aisle, have watched the conflict edge closer and closer. The intelligence community provided accurate and clear information on the situation, and for this I commend them. I also commend them for releasing the vast majority, if not all of the information they had in an attempt to deter Putin. That didn't work. However, there is no question we should have taken action sooner rather than later, and it's time to do so now in a much more aggressive fashion. In preparation for this invasion, many of my Senate colleagues and I drafted hard-hitting sanctions and called repeatedly for more lethal assistance for months. We used all leverage at our disposal to pressure the administration to take sufficient action, but despite our actions, our efforts, it didn't happen. Certainly, some military assistance was provided, but it is hard not to think that if we had expedited Javelin and Stinger deliveries last year and let our allies move more equipment sooner, the Ukrainians would be making the Russians pay a much higher price. Right now, Ukraine desperately needs the support of the international community. It needs us to sanction Russia, to punish its government for this unjustified attack. These Ukrainian heroes need more weapons, armor, and supplies to fight back the Russian invaders and preserve the lives of its population. The Biden administration was well-intentioned in pursuit of a diplomatic resolution for Russia's aggression, but the administration was wrong to oppose our congressional efforts to impose even tougher sanctions that were essential to make our deterrence credible. President Biden made it clear that maximum economic sanctions would only come after Putin invaded. The administration's promise that the threat of sanctions would be enough to deter Putin was a mistake. Look where we are now. Diplomacy has failed. The invasion has happened. While sanctions have now been levied on Russia, there is still room for more robust sanctions in order to get Putin to pull back. I have always said I am all in on all of the above when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. I'm happy to support legislation proposed by my Democrat colleagues, but the Senate must take the lead and mandate the massive economic sanctions that President Biden and his officials committed to. The Nyet Act, which I introduced 2 weeks ago with numerous co-sponsors, contains the tough sanctions that will bring the hammer down on Putin and his regime and provide the assistance that Ukrainians need now. It's based on the bipartisan negotiations that took place over the last 2 months and includes many measures that have been endorsed by members on both sides of the aisle. To be clear, I understand that my friends on the other side are going to object to this. Nonetheless, a good number of the things they suggested are in this bill. The Nyet Act places sanctions on Russia's lucrative mining, mineral, and oil and gas sectors, actions that the administration thus far has refused to take. This needs to be done, and we haven't received an explanation as to why they haven't done it. It punishes Russian and Belarusian government and military officials for their horrific actions and will expose the full extent of Putin's and his cronies on the left. The bill sanctions 12 of the largest Russian banks and critically also imposes secondary sanctions on them, something the administration has yet to do. Secondary sanctions are critical to hurting the Russian economy. They force the world's financial institutions to make a choice between Russia and Western markets. They will choose the West. Indeed, for their own good, they must choose the West. Russia will be isolated. When it comes to sanctions, I want to thank Senator Toomey for helping on that part of this bill, and he's going to talk about them in a minute in just a minute for just a period of time. Nyet also increases the funding for military assistance to Ukraine, as well as other Eastern European nations, to Radio Free Europe, to Radio Liberty, the Global Engagement Center, and refills the president's drawdown account. It also establishes a new Ukrainian resistance fund to help Ukraine continue to resist attempts to occupy or subjugate any new territory Russia seizes, while sending a clear message to Putin that his military will pay a price for advances into sovereign Ukrainian territory. Their resistance has been nothing short of awe-inspiring. That is the Ukrainian people themselves. We need to help them, and this bill, the Nyet Act, will do exactly that. I hope my colleagues across the aisle will put aside partisanship and join us today by passing this bill, which will impose crippling sanctions on Russia's most powerful people and which will support the people of Ukraine. All of us are moved by the Ukrainian people and their fight for freedom. And I know my Democrat colleagues can and have supported nearly all of these concepts at one time or another. I ask them to join me today. This is the most deliberative body in the world, we always say. Well, we've over-deliberated, and it's time to act. I want to yield the floor to Senator Toomey.
Madam President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to thank the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for the work that he has done on this for years. I just want to make a couple of points here. One is, it's a very hard point to make, but I think we ought to be candid, and that is there is a very real danger that the Russian military will eventually prevail. Let's be honest, they're much larger, they have far more resources. The Ukrainians are putting up an absolutely historic and heroic fight, but it's not clear that they can hold on indefinitely. So what should we be doing in light of that fact and the circumstances we have? I completely agree with Senator Risch. We have an obligation, in my mind, to provide the resources that we can. We're doing that. This legislation would go further. There's one other thing that we can do that I think is extremely important as well, and that is to establish as a goal that as soon as possible, Vladimir Putin come to regret this decision. It's extremely important, in my mind, that Putin and all the other authoritarians and bullies and dictators around the world see this invasion of Ukraine as a terrible strategic mistake for Russia to have made. Because if they don't conclude that this was a mistake, then it doesn't end with Ukraine. So how do we ensure that this is universally recognized, including by Putin and those who would like to emulate him? How do we make sure that they see it as the mistake that we believe it is? There's one way to do this. We bring the Russian economy to its knees. And we have the ability to do that, but we have chosen not to do so thus far. Now, I'm pleased to see the administration moving in the direction of sanctioning. I'm pleased that many of our European allies have taken steps to go in this direction. But, Madam President, until we shut down the main source of revenue for Putin and his war machine, we will not have accomplished what we need to accomplish. This legislation does that. Among other things, it directly imposes the sanctions on oil and gas industry, the industry that is 60% of all Russian exports, 40% of government revenue, more than 20% of the entire economy. It goes after this source of cash to fund the war-fighting machine directly with sanctions, but it also does it in an indirect fashion that's very important. And I want to touch on this. That is, this legislation imposes what we call secondary sanctions on the Russian banking sector. Why is that important? We've all heard that some Russian banks are going to be excluded from the SWIFT system. That is true and that is constructive. However, it is not dispositive by any means. The SWIFT system is just a communication system. There's no money actually transfer on SWIFT payments aren't made, and if we deny Russian banks access to SWIFT, we don't deny them the ability to conduct business, the ability to move money. On behalf of oligarchs and oil and gas industry, we don't cut off the flow of revenue to Putin, not just by kicking them off SWIFT. We make it inconvenient for them, but there are workarounds that you can use to get around the obstacles. What we need to do, and what we do in this legislation, is we make a very simple proposition to the entire world. Banks all around the world will understand if this legislation becomes law, they have a choice to make. They can do business with Russian banks, or they can do business with the United States of America, but they can't do both. Madam President, that is not a tough decision for the world's banks. The overwhelming majority, and all of the significant ones, will choose to do business with the United States. And that shuts down the Russian banking industry. That shuts down the revenue stream for Vladimir Putin. That shuts down the money that is funding this appalling, atrocious military campaign. Are there any consequences to us? It's possible that for some period of time there'd be somewhat higher energy prices. We don't import very much Russian energy products. We shouldn't be importing any at this point. We don't import much. But the fact is, we can make up for a disruption in supply by enhancing our own production and encouraging the increase on the part of swing producers who are much more closely allied with us than with the Russians. Madam President, the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian people's elected leaders have been absolutely heroic. They are fighting for their very lives. And as I say, if Putin does not conclude that this was all a very big mistake, then it doesn't end with Ukraine. I join my colleagues in urging the adoption of this legislation, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Florida.
Madam President, I thank my colleagues, Senator Risch and Toomey, for their leadership on these efforts. Americans are watching Russia's invasion into Ukraine, and they're looking to us for leadership. As an evil tyrant wages war, they're asking how our government will respond. So here we are. Congress is in session, and Senator Schumer has placed the world's most pressing issue on the back burner. What could be more important than supporting a fellow democracy under attack against a thug whose goal is to control as much of Europe as he can? A postal reform bill and a radical abortion bill. Their freedom, wealth, and resources of Europe are under attack. Senator Schumer wants to use our time to ensure more unborn babies can be killed and pass a postal reform bill that doesn't actually provide any long-term reform for America's postal workers. And for what? So that President Biden has some progressive talking points he can use during his speech? This is wrong. Even Switzerland, which has spent decades with a strong sense of neutrality, took decisive action this week and froze the assets of Putin and his thugs. The Ukrainian people are being pushed out of their country and are losing their lives as they bravely defend their homes. We're hearing stories of Ukrainian grandfathers taking up arms to defend their families. Why can't the Senate not come to work ready to take on the gross attacks by Putin? He's threatening to use nuclear weapons, and he's threatening NATO members with cyber attacks and subversion. Yet Senator Schumer wants to put the Senate's focus elsewhere. And we all know that Postal Service is not in dire straits. It will continue delivering the mail this week, next week, and the week after. But the same cannot be said about the continued self-rule of Ukraine or peace and stability in Europe as Putin threatens to expand this war. That's why Senator Risch and I sent a letter to Senator Schumer asking he delay bringing up the postal reform bill and prioritize our support for the people of Ukraine. When Putin is threatening to undo our global order and seize further control of wealth and power across Europe, Congress must act swiftly and severely. Placing any other legislation, especially a bill which does not address any urgent issues, ahead of addressing the turmoil in Europe is a dereliction of our duty to the American people and a betrayal of our responsibility to stand for freedom and support the world's democracies. At a time like this, we need to be clear about our priorities. First, the United States must continue to work with our allies and partners to destroy the Russian economy and levy devastating sanctions against the Russian oligarchy and Putin's thugs and cronies, both in and outside the Kremlin. Second, the U.S. must supply Ukraine with every weapon needed and continue to work with our allies and partners to deliver resources to Ukraine's military and the Ukrainian people. Third, we must prioritize and increase our own defense spending to ensure maximum military readiness as we face both Communist China and Putin's aggression. Now is not the time for weakness or any compromise of America's national defense capabilities. Fourth, we must also immediately ban Russian aircraft from using American airspace. Fifth, the Biden administration must immediately roll back its failed Green New Deal policies and take action to boost U.S. energy production and independence. They should restart the Keystone XL pipeline and stop purchasing oil from Russia. Sixth, all lobbyists currently working with the Russian government, Russian oligarchs, and other Russian interests should immediately cancel their contracts. The same goes for those representing countries that refuse to condemn Russia's invasion or are aiding Russia's attempts to evade sanctions. It is inexcusable for any American to be lobbying on behalf of Putin's evil regime or those supporting it. Seventh, all state and local governments should take every action possible to end their relationship with Russian federal and local governments and with Russian-owned businesses. A number of states and local governments have already taken this step, and we applaud their leadership. Finally, every American should take care to not purchase Russian-made products. Just like with Communist China, buying products made in Russia will only fuel Putin's war. One of the best tools America has at its disposal is our ability to destroy the Russian economy and inflict maximum pain on Putin and his oligarch thugs. Now is the time for all Americans to come together in defense of freedom and democracy, and the Senate must lead by example. It is why I'm proud to work with my colleague from Idaho on the Never Yielding Europe's Territory Act, or the Nyet Act, to provide the critical support Ukraine needs to defend itself and deter Russian aggression, while imposing real costs on the Kremlin for its ongoing aggression against Ukraine. The Senate should act immediately on this bill. American leadership is needed now more than ever, and taking these steps now is how we as a nation stand up against evil. Until this conflict is over, supporting Ukraine and making the horrific war as painful as possible for Putin and his evil regime must be our top focus. I yield back to Senator Risch.
Thank you, Senator. In closing, let me just say Ukrainians are dying. They're dying in a heroic fight, in a classic David versus Goliath fight. We can do something. We should do something. We've talked and talked, we've debated, and it's time to act. I ask unanimous consent that the Foreign Relations Committee be discharged from further consideration of Senate Bill 3652 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, reserving the right to object. First of all, let me agree with my Republican colleagues. We stand in awe today of the Ukrainian people, of President Zelensky, of the Ukrainian military. They have given the Russians more than they thought was coming. They have stood up a defense and a resistance that the world has watched with admiration. And the jury is frankly still out as to whether the Russians can make good on their plans, given how fierce the Ukrainians have fought. And I've been proud to stand with my colleagues on this floor as we have delivered additional aid to Ukraine, as we've made sure they've had the javelins and the stingers necessary to protect themselves. I've been proud to visit Ukraine with many of my colleagues here today, and we are going to continue to stand with the Ukrainian people. But I want to make 2 points today with respect to the effort that has been undertaken by my good friend, the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee. First, let me make a specific point on the merits of the bill that is being proposed here today. Passing this bill with no committee process, no amendments, no debate would be a terrible idea. What this bill does, essentially, is to shatter American unity with Europe, with Japan, with South Korea, with all the allies that have stood with us over the course of this past week. President Biden spent the last 2 months methodically building a never-before-seen coalition of nations to impose the most significant set of sanctions ever seen. And this bill would undo that. Why? Because this bill would mandate that the United States impose certain new sanctions over Europe's objection. It calls for the United States to abandon our policy of focusing on multilateral sanctions and start over with unilateral sanctions. Why is that a terrible idea? Well, first, because unilateral sanctions just aren't as effective as multilateral sanctions are. When you're talking about energy policy, you want the Europeans with you because that's where the Russian energy ends up. Without Europe going at it alone, it makes the United States look weak, and the sanctions just aren't as effective. But second, this bill is a bad idea because breaking with Europe and our NATO partners right now, that's exactly what Vladimir Putin wants. Yes, he wants to control Ukraine, but what he wants more is to smash the transatlantic alliance to pieces. He sees the invasion of Ukraine as a wedge that will cause America to squabble and break with our allies. Putin is setting a trap for us, and this bill would have us walk right into that trap. Third, let's be clear, with a couple of small exceptions, President Biden has already done everything that this bill calls for and more. This bill calls for sanctions on those responsible for the buildup of forces around Ukraine. The administration's imposed sanctions on Vladimir Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, 13 other members of Russia's Security Council. This bill calls for sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is done. Thanks to the committed diplomatic efforts of the Biden administration, the German government has put an end to Nord Stream 2, and we've applied the sanctions. This bill calls for sanctions on oligarchs. But Biden did that with our allies. And he went further. He launched a task force that's going to identify, freeze, and take from Russian oligarchs their assets. This bill calls for sanctions on financial institutions. The administration has already targeted all 10 of Russia's largest financial institutions, which hold more than 3/4 of the Russian financial sector's total assets. This bill calls for a prohibition on investment in occupied Ukrainian territory. President Biden did that on the first day of the war. This bill calls for sanctioning transactions involving Russian sovereign debt. President Biden did that on the second day of the war. This bill calls for sanctions on Belarus. President Biden's levied sanctions on 24 Belarusian individuals, 2 state-owned banks, and 13 of the country's industries. President Biden has put together a sanctions package that is sweeping, that is unprecedented, that is breaking the back of the Russian economy. So why are we down here on the floor engaged in this back and forth? And that brings me to my second point, a broader one. It used to be that the all-consuming politics of this town sometimes would take a break when the crisis was big enough. Sometimes they would stop at the water's edge. This was the case in 2001, when this country was attacked. Republicans were in charge of the White House and both houses of Congress, and Democrats certainly had the choice to blame the attack on President Bush to try to score political points. Democrats could have come down to the floor to offer partisan bills. Democrats in the Senate could have used their minority prerogatives to block Bush's national security nominees, but that's not what happened in 2001. Democrats and Republicans came together because at that moment, patriotism, the love of your country, the defense of your country was more important than politics or party. Now today, the shoe's on the other foot. Democrats control the White House, the House, and the Senate. And while our nation wasn't attacked last week, I'd argue that this moment is the most perilous that the United States and the world has faced, certainly since 2001, but given the nuclear stakes involved in a conflict with Russia, perhaps the most perilous since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I get it, the professional outrage machine that dominates American politics today has deluded a lot of folks into Congress into believing that unity is weakness, that putting your country over party is an anachronism. But I don't believe that. I believe that sometimes the stakes are so high that you've got to put aside your politics, at least temporarily. Put aside your disagreements and get behind your government. Now, let's be honest, as this crisis has grown in seriousness over and over again, Republicans have had the chance to do what Democrats did in 2001, elevate loyalty to country. But all through 2021, even as senators were made aware of Russia's plans to invade Ukraine, Senators Cruz and Hawley and a few others continued to put politics first by blocking every single national security nominee who came before this body, including those nominees who would have been working to try to help Ukraine and stop the Russian invasion. Last month, Republicans and Democrats were working on a bipartisan bill to support Ukraine in its time of need. Those negotiations were difficult, but instead of staying at the table, Republicans walked away and with virtually no notice to Democrats introduced this bill with only Republicans supporting it. And now, instead of rallying behind a president who has shocked the world by uniting friends and foes behind an unprecedented set of crippling sanctions against Russia, Republicans are down here on the floor, not more than a week since the Russian invasion began, to highlight their grievances with the president's policies. Russia invaded less than a week ago. We returned to Washington last night. And instead of deciding to sit down with Republicans today and work on agreeing on a package of support for Ukraine, like the one that President Biden has requested, Republicans have instead chosen to spend today, our first day back in the Senate since the invasion, playing politics, trying to force a vote on a bill that they wrote that not a single Democrat supports, that everybody knows is not going to pass, has no chance of passing. Now, we could do the same thing. Democrats could just put a bill on the floor that we only negotiated with ourselves and force Republicans to vote on it. We could choose to use this week to highlight the differences between Republicans and Democrats, but we're not going to do that, because our priority is to try to work together with our Republican colleagues to find unity at this moment, to not use the first day that we are back in session since the invasion began to highlight the differences between our two parties. And frankly, when I look at what Republicans have been calling on President Biden to do, I don't see a lot of daylight. I don't see a lot of reason for complaint. I don't see the imperative to come down here and highlight the differences. Nord Stream 2 is gone. It's not happening. SWIFT sanctions, previously opposed by Europe, are now happening. Russian banks are being crippled. Assets of Russian oligarchs are being seized. Vladimir Putin is being personally sanctioned. Embargoes are being put on key technologies sent into Russia. The set of sanctions that President Biden announced, it goes further than what most all observers and pundits predicted. It's frankly stunning how successful President Biden's diplomacy has been. And it just strains all credibility for Republicans to suddenly claim that this diplomacy is irrelevant and all these countries were going to impose these sanctions even if President Biden did nothing. I wish my colleagues could see the seriousness of this moment and the need for us to focus our energies on coming together instead of playing into our enemy's hands and showing our differences at this moment. Our president has rallied the world to this fight. Vladimir Putin is reeling, but we're forced to spend time today debating a partisan bill introduced by only one party that has no chance of passage. Because today on this floor, scoring political points seems more important than finding a way to come together with the president, with both parties, around our support for Ukraine. And for those reasons, I object.
Madam President.
Objection is heard. Senator from Idaho.
Madam President, in rebuttal to my good friend's comments, first of all, let me say that a number of the things I do take exception with, for instance, his statement that if we pass this, we're going to somehow shatter the unanimity with which the world has come together to oppose this. Nothing could be further from the truth. Certainly, the sanctions that we have put on have been in conjunction with a lot of our allies and a lot of our partners. Simply putting on secondary sanctions, again, in conjunction with our allies and our partners, will not in any way shatter that at all. My good friend says, why are we here on the floor today? Senator, I would say the reason we're on here on the floor today is it's not enough. Now, you said I came down here to criticize the president. I did not criticize the president in anything I said. I applaud the action he's taken. I want him to take more. We have a convoy that's 40 miles long that's headed for Kyiv. Now, that convoy started out after all of these sanctions that the president put in place had taken effect. The banks, as you know, shut down, at least temporarily, in Russia. They've closed their stock market. They've done a number of things, but it's not enough. We need to toughen up. And as you know, I have talked with the administration to try to get them to embrace secondary sanctions, because it's the secondary sanctions that are truly going to shut the thing down lock, stock, and barrel. And Putin's going to have to answer to his people if we do get shut down. Look, this is not partisan. I'm not here to try to drive a wedge in the party. And as you know, your party had substantial input into the Nyet Act that we have here. The chairman of the committee, I think, negotiated in good faith as we put this together. I've told him that personally. I've said that publicly. The fact is we came very close to the bill, and the Nyet bill is very close to what we agreed to, but we couldn't come together on the last few things, and that is a permanent shutdown of Nord Stream 2, not just the sanctions that are in place on a temporary basis, but a permanent shutdown, and on secondary sanctions, which we believe will be the final nail in the coffin for the economy in Russia. So again, I answer the question you asked, why are we here? We're here because it's not enough. The convoys are continuing. There's tens of thousands of more soldiers, Russian soldiers, that are entering the Ukraine. They're having a tough time of it. And I agree with Senator Toomey. You sit here and you see what's going on. The question you have to ask is, how long can the Ukrainians hold out? We want them to hold out. There are provisions in this act, as you know, that provides additional help for the Ukrainians themselves, but most importantly, what it will do is it will flat shut down the economy in Russia. In addition to that, you and I have discussed, I think, the fact that we can never use sanctions in a manner where we or our allies get hurt worse than the enemy does, or for that matter, to any great extent. That's why there are waivers in here. And sanctions always have waiver provisions in them so that it can take the edge off on anything that causes us or our allies any difficulties. So in that regard, I think that you're wrong on that. Back to the basic bill, I said I'm an all-of-the-above person. If the Democrats want to bring their bill down, which will probably look very much like this, but it won't have secondary sanctions in it. It won't have a permanent closing of Nord Stream 1 and 2. I will stand up here and say, we can do better, but I'm still going to vote for your bill. And I wish you would do that. I wish you would do that on mine. But I would respectfully request that you back away from this complaint that this is a partisan exercise. It is not a partisan exercise. There isn't a person in this body that doesn't want to do all we can possibly do to preserve the lives of the Ukrainians that are perishing every day, women, children, civilians, and we need to do all we can. And Putin is not going to be deterred until we do all that we can, and that comes to permanently shutting down completely shutting down the economy in Russia. This bill does that. And again, I apologize if you think that there's anything political about this. It's not. It's trying to do the right thing. As you and I have talked about, we have an obligation to do this as Americans, as the strongest country in the world. We can't stand by and watch this slaughter that is happening, and when that convoy gets there, is going to be even worse. This is something we can actually do to do more than what the president has done. And I'll say it, I said it before and I'll say it again. I commend the president for what he's done. But we also, as the first branch of government, have a responsibility. We believe this bill exercises that responsibility. Thank you, Madam President.